Hi, we are live. I'm Candice Malcolm, and I am joined by my colleague of the True North Initiative, Andrew Lawton. We're trying something new here today, so we're trying to do the double streaming with both of us. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I can barely get my computer working most days, but today we're doing a technological experiment. So I make no guarantees. If anything happens, let me just say, first off, to all the people watching, it will be my fault. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. If anything goes wrong, it will be on me. But anyways, good to be doing this.
We'll blame Andrew, no problem.
Yes. Well, that works for most things. So.
Well, yeah, so this is the guinea pig run, and hopefully things go smoothly. There's a lot to get to today. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you, Andrew, about it, because I feel like we were bombarded for so long with these horrific terrorist attacks in Europe. They seem to happen so frequently that, you know, at first when something happens, you know, the very first ones that occurred, maybe the Charlie Hebdo shootings that happened at that French satirical newspaper carried out by an ISIS jihadist, you know, there was just endless outpouring of, you know, sympathy and support and solidarity with France. But then you had, you know, one after another, after another, after another. They all kind of almost blend together. And now, I mean, there was a deadly terrorist attack that happened in Strasbourg this week. And it wasn't trending on Twitter. It wasn't, you know, on the front pages of the main media sites. You kind of had to dig to find out information about it. Did you notice that? And maybe you can provide just an overview and an update on what the latest is from Strasbourg.
Yeah, I will. And I think just to start off on the media component, that's a very valid point you raised, because I think that it shows a general complacency that we have about these sorts of terrorist attacks. I mean, we used to measure terrorism by the casualty accounts and you know, the 9/11 levels of numbers, you know, 3,000 people killed. And then it became where the frequency was far more relevant. So you'd have these, you know, attacks where there might not have even been fatalities. You know, someone runs a van in the road, maybe it's a couple, 3, 4, or maybe a few more. But now this is back page news. And I remember when I was in Israel, not in 2015, but the first time I went in 2011, one of the people I had the chance to interview there was a Jerusalem Associated Press reporter. And one of the things he said is that, you know, what the world is front page news about terrorism in the Middle East, in Jerusalem is back page news because they're so used to it. And I feel that in the last 7 years, there's been a flip there where now these things are not front page news. And I don't take any nobility in that. It's like not like, oh, well, you know, we're refusing to let ourselves be terrorized. No, it's people refusing to confront the realities of it. And to look at what's happened in Strasbourg, I have my computer open just because there have been some developments recently here. But Sharif Shakat was the suspect. Police shot him after a 2-day-long manhunt, and there were 3 people that were killed at a Christmas market, which is not the first time we've seen that type of attack before. But as is the case in almost all of these, he was known to police and had been on a watch list as a security threat. And I find this infuriating because we often hear about these lone wolves, and I think the line that's been used by a number of people is that the lone wolves are invariably always known wolves, because these are people that have been on lists, they've been on police radar, whether it was Faisal Hussein in Toronto, whether it's Sharif Shakat here, whether it's the people that have been involved in the past Paris attacks, Brussels attacks, Germany, it doesn't matter. They're known. And I think that the two are related here. When you look at, on one hand, names that are known to authorities and people that are still committing acts of terror, and on the other side, these acts of terror are not actually getting much in the way of media coverage. And there's a general ignorance or a malicious ignorance that comes about when people just don't pay attention to these things. And that's what we're seeing with Strasbourg. And I think that's incredibly problematic for a number of reasons, but even just for the pragmatic reasons alone, that you've got all these people on watch lists, and that only becomes relevant information after they commit an act of terror.
Well, exactly. I mean, the question of how can someone be on a terror watch list? How can authorities be actively aware of a person, somehow tracking, you know, their every movement? You know, it gives you some sort of peace of mind in Canada to think, okay, the government says that there's 60 terrorists that had traveled abroad to fight for ISIS or other groups. They're back in Canada, but at least the government is monitoring them, so hopefully they won't, do anything horrible, and officials will be able to stand in and stop them. But then you have stories like this of someone being on an official watch list. I remember it was the same thing with a UK terrorist who blew himself up at the Ariana Grande concert.
Yeah.
And he was also well known to authorities. He had just traveled back to Libya and had only been in the UK for a couple of days when he carried out that just gruesome attack. So, it's not a lot of solace for the families of the victims that there's even any competency when it comes to, especially in Europe. But the communication and the activities by these security officials is supposed to keep us safe, and yet they can't even keep track of the people they know are terrorists in our communities.
Yeah, and I think the one big question mark that's over these is, where is the actual watching of people on watch lists? I mean, a watch list is not meant to just be some obscure database buried on the hard drive of some police agency. A watch list is supposed to be about the actual watching part. And, for all the people go on about no-fly list, well, the no-fly list at least is somewhat enforced, because if someone's on a no-fly list, it means that they're not going to be able to fly. And if someone is on a watch list, it stands to reason that we are keeping tabs on them in some way. And I know that law enforcement agencies will say, well, we can't surveil people 24/7, and I get that. But surely what they're doing isn't working when you've got so many of these people that they're saying, oh, yes, he was known to authorities as being a radical. And I'm like, well, what good did that do? I'd rather they say, well, he was a complete stranger to us. No one saw this coming. We had no idea who he was. Like, he was a saint. He was an angel. Because then at least I'd say, all right, well, I guess this couldn't have been prevented. But every single time one of these attacks take place, and we know that police literally at some point made the determination that, we think this guy is someone to watch, that suggests that a lot of these, if not most of these, are preventable. And, terrorism is bad enough. When you put in that something could have been prevented, it becomes an absolute abomination. And Europe has become far too forgiving and far too complacent. And we know that North America is often downstream of what trends are going on in Europe on demography and terrorism by sometimes 5 or 10 years. And I fear that's the case here. So it's one thing to look at Europe and say, you guys need to smarten up. We also need to make sure we don't follow that example. And I know you've done a lot on this, of pointing out how the current government has been very much disengaged from really monitoring actively a lot of the returning ISIS fighters. And that suggests we may be closer to Europe than, we usually are.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I wanted to bring up another case of a terrorist attack that happened this week in another part of the world that, sometimes it feels like Canada is becoming more and more like Israel. I think Israel's long been saying, we've had to live with the reality of terrorism in our backyard and at our borders every single day for decades. And this reality is just kind of coming to fruition in Europe and in Canada. So, I think Israel does a lot of things right when it comes to combating terrorism and actually having the stomach to confront it and name it and do what's necessary to stop it. Unfortunately, you can't stop everything. And so on Sunday evening, there was basically a drive-by shooting where a Hamas terrorist took out a gun and just mowed people down at a bus stop in Israel. He shot 7 people. One of the couples that he shot, this is just absolutely devastating, a Canadian couple, a 21-year-old man whose family's from Montreal, and his Israeli wife who was 8 months pregnant. The terrorist shot her in the stomach. I don't know how you can look at people waiting at a bus stop and see them as an enemy target, like a military target. I also don't know how you could see an 8-month pregnant woman and see her stomach, her pregnant stomach, as a target. But anyways, this terrorist shot her in the stomach. The baby was delivered. It was alive, and sadly it died of its injuries, the baby's injuries yesterday, which is really just horrifying and sad. The most despicable kind of crime imaginable is killing a baby. And so, and you have that connection to Canada. I think that there has been a little bit of outcry. I've seen bits of it, but I don't think that this is really even making media, making news, and certainly not the mainstream media. And, it just kind of serves as a reminder not only that this kind of stuff is an everyday occurrence in Israel. The terrorist who did the shooting was killed, and he's being praised. You can see the praise on social media from Hamas propaganda sites, as well as verified Twitter accounts that claim to speak for the Palestinian government, glorifying this man, calling him a martyr, calling him a hero. And again, this is sort of the mentality and the reality of these just deranged ideological jihadists. They see people in everyday situations as targets. They kill them, and then they get celebrated and praised within their communities. And there's a bias in the media as well, Andrew, as you well know. The Guardian newspaper reported, 4 people died in Israel, 2 Israelis, 2 Palestinians. They make it seem like it's just this total equivalence between the two sides that died. It's like, okay, well, the two Palestinians who died were the terrorists who killed the 2 Israelis, and then the terrorists were killed by Israeli forces. So that's not really an equivalency, and to sort of paint it as just, oh, there's a violent clash and 4 people died, 2 from each side, it doesn't really properly paint the picture of what has actually happened, which, again, is just, incredibly, incredibly sad. I don't know, you've been to Israel a couple of times. Do you think that there's things that we can take away from this, that we can learn from something like this? Or, how can we ever protect ourselves from these kind of random one-off killings that happen?
Well, what makes the Israel example, I think, so insidious is that the willingness for people to commit what we would characterize as acts of terror, as I think this one very accurately is described by, is not a radical view in some of the Palestinian pockets. It's quite a mainstream view. And look, in 2015, I was in Israel, and you and I were actually on the same trip. And I remember one of the most really standout moments of that delegation for me was speaking with a man who is a Palestinian talk show host. And what was fascinating is that we were sitting down with him, and at the time in 2015 there had been a rash of stabbings in the streets of Israel, of Palestinian terrorists stabbing random Jews. One of them a couple of days earlier to this had been an older lady, which I think is one notch below a baby as far as the level of evil goes. And I was asking this guy who was speaking very candidly with us about this, and he had said that he did a topic on his show, his call-in talk show not long ago, is it okay to stab Jews in the streets? And he was so proud to say to me, most who called in said no. And I'm thinking, I was a talk show host at the time, and I'm thinking, how well would that go over if I had said, all right, is it okay to, stab Jews in the streets? Call now. Your call's after news and traffic. And to find even one person in North America that would say, well, yeah, I think they've got it coming. But there, it was like a 60-40. Like, 40% of the people that called in said, yeah, stabbing Jews. So this is not a radical view. And I think that in that case, Israel is in a perpetual state of war. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And except Israel is hell-bent on going after the terrorists, whereas the terrorists are hell-bent on going after anyone who's Israeli. And they view no distinction between an IDF soldier in fatigues and a pregnant Canadian woman and her child. They are both the same. They are both completely fine with those being casualties of war.
So it's just so evil and so reprehensible. And, like you said, it's not just, admitting that those are your views. It's not like calling into if a pollster calls your house and asks, what are your private views when it comes to like personal social issues. It's like they're so not ashamed of wanting to kill people who aren't them that they'd be willing to express their views openly on a talk radio show, even with identifying their names. And again, it goes to the sort of much deeper structural issues at play here. The fact that there's propaganda in the schools, that they're raised, brainwashed and embedded with these ideas. As we know, the Canadian government gives a lot of aid to the Palestinian areas and Palestinian people in and around Israel. And part of the major concern is like, how is this money being spent? How is it being monitored? The United Nations group itself, UNRWA, has long documented ties to Hamas, to terrorism, to using UN facilities like, meeting rooms, ambulances, all this kind of stuff to help run guns and to smuggle weapons and to be active figures in the war. And then, Canada is paying these organizations. There's not really any kind of transparency or proper monitoring of our funds. So it's just, it's such a terrible and sad situation over there. And I don't really see it getting any better. I'm just, hoping that stuff doesn't ever really spill into Canada. And I do want to talk about, on that topic, the Canadian government released its annual report yesterday on the terrorist threat to Canada. I put a quick analysis up of it, just sort of my overview in the sort of weird political correctness that it seeped into it, and the sort of lack of willingness to identify ties to ISIS. One of the weird things, Andrew, in the report is that it stated over and over again that there were no terrorist attacks in Canada in 2018. Now, you have to have a pretty warped understanding of the world and of current events and what's happened in 2018 to make a claim like that, which is what the federal government has done. They acknowledged that there were violent attacks and that there were deadly attacks in Canada, but then just sort of plainly state that they weren't terrorism. What's your take on that?
Well, I always dislike making these things or any things about semantics only, but the characterization and classification when it comes to terrorism is important, more so than most other distinctions of violent crime, because the way you tackle it is different. I mean, the way you tackle, gang violence in Toronto is different than the way you tackle domestic violence, which is different from the way you tackle terrorism and radicalism. And I think the Faisal Hussein case was a classic example of this, a Danforth Ave shooter where, like a lot of these cases, it may seem like there's a bit of a gray area. Can you say it's terrorism? Can you say it's mental illness? Can you say it's whatever? And I think that the line between those two oftentimes is very blurry because of the types of people that ISIS is trying to propagandize and radicalize. And any time there is at all an ideology component of this that involves radicalism, you have to explore the terrorism angle. And what we're seeing a lot of now is where police will say we can't rule it out, and that's the end of it. And then you think, all right, maybe they're still looking into it until you get to the end of the year and a report comes out that said no terrorism. Problem solved. It's magic. And when governments do that, they're trying to say that there is no problem whatsoever. And this is the type of report that will be used by people, and I think we're already seeing it, to say, there's more of a threat from right-wing extremists and, right-wing radicals and this sort of stuff. And that's going to happen a lot more, because just because you put in a report that nothing happened doesn't mean that nothing happened. But this becomes the basis of government policy on it. And look, a life lost is a life lost. And I think that we can't make every tragic incident political, but you have to understand the political undertones that are taking place through this. And we've got a government that would much rather focus on doing absolutely nothing and saying that everything is a random act of violence than suggest that there is a global threat that terrorism poses.
Well, there's a couple things that are interesting about what you said. First of all, mental illness is not a motive. Mental illness doesn't cause you to wake up one morning and decide to go butcher a bunch of people randomly, indiscriminately on the street. I mean, a person having mental illness may contribute to, their episodes and their, willingness to carry that, something like that out. But that's not the thing that sparks your decision to do it. And so the whole idea of the whole concept behind terrorism is as politically motivated violence. And so I just really don't understand how, in the case of the Danforth shooter, it was like, well, his family said he's mentally ill, case closed. Like, that doesn't really give us any further insight into why this man decided to commit such a heinous crime. And, at the time, the police said that they hadn't, like you said, they hadn't ruled out terrorism, but then they never provided any kind of update to the public to say, we monitored his social media account, which they did, and there were reports that said that authorities found that he had visited ISIS propaganda websites. ISIS themselves took responsibility for the attack. Now, the police now say that was
not according to the government.
That was false. Yeah, they falsely took credit for the account. It's like, okay, prove exactly why you say that's false. Like you throw the word falsely in there as if that's a fact that's been proven, but there has been other connections, and it's like you just look at the guy, you know, he basically fits the mold exactly of a would-be jihadist terrorist. I think I can't remember the exact details. I know his family came from Afghanistan. I can't remember if he was born in Canada or Afghanistan, but he had recently visited Afghanistan. He had traveled there. I know the police report that they did release to media, and then I think it got leaked to the public, showed that when his parents were interviewed immediately after the attack, they gave completely contradictory accounts as to what his background was. You know, the mom said that he'd never left Canada. The dad said that he traveled to Afghanistan. The mom said that he didn't play video games. The dad said that he spent all his time playing video games. It was just sort of this weird, like, disconnect. You know,
and even the mental illness rationale was split. I think it was the dad said yes, he had mental illness issues, and the mom said no, or it might have been the other way around.
Yeah, it was the other way
around.
But
again, we're talking about, you know, a family of 4 or 5 that lived in like a 3 or 4 bedroom apartment here. I mean, we're not talking about people that, you know, lived in some 20-bedroom mansion and never saw each other. Like, these were people in very confined spaces that somehow had no idea what the lives of each other were like.
Right, yeah. So it was just very strange. And so, you know, at the time you can kind of say, okay, there's a lot of public anger and frustration. People obviously feel like their city is under attack in Toronto. And, you know, there's a lot of misreporting and misremembering that happens in the wake of these kind of attacks. Eyewitnesses are sort of, you know, they're known for not remembering things accurately, and it was interesting to go through all the different eyewitness accounts describing the shooting, because there was just a lot of, you know, information is just proven to not be true about what the suspect looked like and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, you kind of expect, okay, there's hype after a terror attack, and then things calm down, and maybe the police will put out like a comprehensive report a couple months later, like, this is what happened, this is who this guy is, this is the motive, this is where he got the guns, this is, you know, and the other thing, you know, a lot of people speculated that he was a experienced shooter just by the way that he was able to carry out that gruesome attack at the Danforth. And so, you know, we're still waiting for the police to release that report. And then in this public safety report put out by the Trudeau government yesterday, it kind of just makes it seem like everything's already been determined. It's, you know, the facts are settled, and we all agree it wasn't ISIS, and yet it's like, well, where's the information coming from? Where's this report coming from? And I think that is quite a disservice to Canadians to not really know what's going on. And then there was another few examples. You know, the Somali migrant who drove through. He first was in his own car, then he commandeered a U-Haul truck and he ran through a crowd of people in Edmonton. He got out and stabbed a police officer, and then he continued his rampage. They found an ISIS flag in his car, and yet the report talks about him and doesn't mention ISIS at all. The woman at Canadian Tire who was swinging a golf club and attacking people in the store, I think she was stabbing people as well. She said multiple times that she was part of ISIS and that she was doing it for ISIS, and the report doesn't mention that she was part of ISIS or she believed.
No, and there was a case, it might have been 2 years ago, I can't remember the guy's name, but the one who stabbed a couple of soldiers at a military recruiting center in North Toronto.
Right.
And he kept saying, you know, I'm an ISIS terrorist, I'm an ISIS terrorist. And they're like, no, you're not. You're mentally ill. He's like, no, I'm doing this for ISIS. And the police are, no, you're sick. And he's like, no, it's like, what does a guy have to do to be taken seriously as an ISIS terrorist now? Like I'm convinced that bin Laden could come out of the grave and say, you know, I hereby resuscitate Al-Qaeda. And they'd be like, no, come on, you're ill, you know, here, sit down, have a Snickers bar. Like, it's insane that we don't even take people at their word, let alone investigating further when these things come up. And, you know, it's funny you mentioned the side of this that I think has not gotten as much play as it needs to, and that is just the serialization of these things. Because when you have this society, and we were talking about this earlier with Strasbourg, where these things are so commonplace, it becomes very easy for governments to never worry about, you know, tying up these cases with a bow and actually putting out that report. And I'll give you one example of this. Look at the Las Vegas shooting in the U.S. the most deadly mass shooting in, the modern American world. One of the most horrific events globally as far as that time goes, and mass violence. So many question marks in that case, so many red flags, so many issues. I mean, ISIS took credit for that one as well, but no resolution. And it could be that police are not convinced that they can resolve it, but people just move on. And every couple of months, someone says, oh, whatever happened with that Vegas shooting, and then people move on. And because we are so accustomed to these acts of violence now, there is no accountability, because people will have moved on to the next one and to the next one. And especially in Europe, by the time the Strasbourg case happens, we're 4 terrorist attacks behind, or 7 terrorist attacks behind the cases that the police are actually, really doing the deep dive into and finding the motive of. And I'm convinced there's never going to be a final report of the Faisal Hussein case. I think the last one that will ever really be, permanently cemented and understood as terrorism will be the 2014 Parliament Hill shooting. And we can look in the 4.5 years since then and find numerous examples where someone has, in the name of Islamic extremism, committed violence. But we're so focused as a society, and our government is so focused on trying to find anything they can to even dent that narrative by putting in, some other factor, that they'll eradicate the terrorism narrative. And, if you look in the UK, for example, their policy is it's terrorism until we prove otherwise, because they know how common these things are. And I think that approach creates different flaws. But in Canada, if they find one little thing that they think it presents an alternative motive, or might even suggest that, they're going to go with that and completely disregard the terrorism motive. And that was what they did with Faisal Hussein, is that, they have some ambiguity about the mental health diagnosis, so let's get rid of the terrorism. And that's what we're going to see a heck of a lot more of now, because people seem to be buying into it.
Well, and, just because you have a mental illness doesn't rule out terrorism. Like, you could be mentally ill and easily recruited by ISIS and carry out an attack. And I think you're right. There's so many, weird euphemisms that we use when talking about this stuff that it helps us, it prevents us from properly understanding, what is going on. So, I think one of the things that ISIS has done is taken credit for attacks where they think that their tactics were carried out, or they're, like the guy in North York who jumped in a rental van and plowed through a crowd of people, right? We've seen this happen in Christmas markets. We saw this happen in Nice. This is straight out of the ISIS playbook of their tactics, how they carry out and kill, and what they've called on people to do. ISIS called on people to get in their car and run over infidels. So when that happened in Toronto, it was well, this is an ISIS-inspired attack. It's using the ISIS tactics that happened. Now, the individual who carried out the attack didn't happen to have anything to do with ISIS. He happened to have some other ideology that led him to carry out the attack, which, again, I would argue makes it terrorism. But because we don't use ISIS-inspired attacks, they consider lone wolf attacks. Like, if an individual is self-radicalized and then he decides on his own that because of ISIS he's going to carry an attack, they call that an ISIS-inspired attack, which isn't. It's just a plain old ISIS attack. That's also part of their strategy, is to have people who aren't necessarily soldiers who have trained in Syria and Iraq carrying out attacks, but having, Canadians or Americans or Australians pick up the robe of terrorism and carry it out. And in the report, they kind of acknowledged that. They said, there are a lot of people who have replicated the tactics of jihadi terrorist groups. The whole section on right-wing extremism, which mentions that young street van attacker, was the right-wing terrorism. One thing that I thought was at least, helpful was that they admitted in the report that, right-wing terrorism is on the rise, but it's not really a thing in Canada. It's a sort of online phenomenon, and it pales in comparison with the threat of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which, again, the report was one half hard-nosed police report from professional security agents and officials who have worked probably all over the world and understand the real threats we face, and then you could tell a Trudeau Liberal official had gone through and edited and added in things here and there to make it more politically correct and more palatable. But it was sort of overall helpful. And I think, even with the Al-Qaeda connection, we kind of forget that that's still a thing that's still an active organization. Maybe it's a good segue, Andrew, to talk a little bit about Omar Khadr, who's back in the news. Let's do a little overview of why he's back in the news, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, so I mean, just for people that are looking for the latest on this, the case is not going to have a decision announced until next week. So you're not missing it if you've been looking online for it. But Omar Khadr says he has been continuously traumatized by the bail conditions, which he says are so restrictive. It's, he's never really finished being at Guantanamo Bay. So
he always finds a way to make himself the victim.
We've been hearing for years that, Guantanamo Bay is just, like being in Abu Ghraib for, so long, and, it's just ongoing torture. And the fact that Omar Khadr thinks, walking around free in Edmonton with $10.5 million is just as bad as being in Guantanamo Bay suggests Guantanamo Bay is actually not as bad as perhaps he was making it out to be. But he says that bail restrictions, because people forget this, he has not been exonerated, he has not been cleared. In the eyes of the American military court system, he is still a convicted, confessed murderer and terrorist. And people forget that he is technically on bail. He hasn't completed his sentence. He hasn't been freed. His conviction hasn't been overturned. He was released from prison pending that appeal. So that, I think, just from a legal jargon perspective, is important here. And a lot of the restrictions that were put in place were very reasonable. At first, it was that he had to be following a curfew and staying with his lawyer and his family, and he could only leave for work or school. And then the internet restrictions got pulled back, and the travel restrictions got pulled back. He's been given temporary access to Ontario a couple of times for family reasons. And one of the most fundamental things that would be expected of any terrorist is, like any other criminal, not cavorting with people that are in that world still. And this is true if you're a mobster on bail, you don't get to talk to your friends in the mob. And if you're a terrorist on bail, you don't get to talk to terrorists. And the one thing that really comes back here is that Omar Khadr wants to ease the restrictions so that he can get a passport to travel to Saudi Arabia, and so that he can, have unsupervised contact with his older sister, Zainab. And, if you were to accept the Omar Khadr /CBC /Justin Trudeau narrative that Omar Khadr is the victim in all of this, let's take for a moment at face value what they say. There is zero ambiguity that his sister is a radical, that his sister is a terror sympathizer. She has said in interviews on record that she supports al-Qaeda, that she supports bin Laden. In one interview, when she didn't know that Omar Khadr would later recant his confession, she said that most families should be proud to have someone like Omar who would throw a grenade and kill a soldier. Like, this is, if you're to find one weak link in the Khadr family, short of the father, who was an al-Qaeda financier, it would be Zainab Khadr. And for Omar Khadr to want to have unsupervised contact with her completely nullifies what he was telling Canadians all the way through his legal process once he got out, which is that, he's not his family, and he was the victim of all of this, and, they've said some things that he doesn't like. And I reread the other day Michelle Shepard, who was a Toronto Star reporter who's a complete shill for Omar Khadr, and I reread her piece about it. And I found that quote where he says, my family was hurt and troubled, and, I'm not them, and people need to judge me on my own. Well, if I am judging Omar Khadr on his own, why does he want to have such close contact with someone who, by all accounts, he should be mad at? Because she's the very representation of the family that got him into trouble in the first place, because the family had these inextricable links to al-Qaeda. And I think that this is so revealing in many ways, because Omar Khadr would be a lot more believable if he had taken a zero-tolerance approach and said, I don't want anything to do with the radicals in my family. My sister, she's not my sister anymore if she's going to get up there and talk about how great bin Laden is and how he's the great martyr. And the problem is, though, is that all of this seems to be irrelevant to the court system and to the government. There is not a single thing that Khadr has asked for in the Canadian courts that he has been turned down. And even with suing the federal government, he asks, for millions of dollars, he gets millions of dollars. So I'm convinced that Friday at 1 p.m. next week, when the judge reveals her decision, it will be that, Khadr has demonstrated that, he can do all of this stuff. Because, yeah, he is a model citizen now. He doesn't need to. There's no grenade. There's no IED. But this is going to be, for Canadians, a watershed moment here of how much you are prepared to completely put your head in the sand about his own comments. I mean, his own comments right now are now being nullified by this.
It's a really good point about his family, and also just, the life that he's lived in the public for the last decade or two. He is used to sort of getting his way. He's used to being painted as the victim, shown incredible deference and sympathy from journalists. I have a friend who worked for the State Department. He was down in Guantanamo Bay as an official down there, a spokesman. And, he just always shook his head at the Canadian and European journalist delegations that would come. I'm talking about J.D. Gordon here, who he's, sort of a Washington official that I've worked with in the past. Anyway, he basically would laugh because it was always during the Canadian winters that all of a sudden all these journalists would want to come down to cover every aspect. It's like, what a coincidence they want to be like in the nice Cuban hot weather. But, Omar Khadr's used to this kind of treatment and almost a weird kind of privilege. And then at the same time, his whole thing, the reason why people have sympathy for him is that they say his wicked family, his evil family has brainwashed him, and he was just this poor child who was manipulated, and he wasn't acting on his own, he was acting...
Yeah, the media narrative has been to separate Khadr from the Khadr family. And now they have to confront the narrative that they've created.
Yeah, it's like, no, he wants to be part of his family. And if you look at sort of some of the statements going back, yeah, he said, I'm not my family, judge me based on me, but he's never come out and fully condemned them. He's never said the things, that we're saying, that his family, had an evil ideology, that what they did to him was wrong, that they were terrorists. He's never used a kind of strong language. He's never...
No, he said, like, they were troubled, they were mistaken, they were angry. He's just like, oh, yeah, they were going through a bad day. And like all of us, I mean, when you go through a bad day, you pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's just a regular Friday in Ontario, but it's insane.
Yeah, and he kind of does that. Everyone has their family, and we all have family problems. It's like, well, no, the whole case upon which you're being treated specially is because supposedly these people brainwashed you. You'd think that he would have a lot more things to say to separate himself. I think that this... every time he's asked for something, as you mentioned, he gets it. It's like he asks for an inch, he takes a mile, he goes further and further and further. And I think this is getting to the point where it's a tipping point. I mean, the Canadian public, I think, is already clear that they're not on this guy's side. That the backlash that Trudeau received after paying Khadr that $10.5 million, which happened in a very secretive, kind of like quiet way, I think that was overwhelming for the Liberals. I don't think they saw it coming. But even now, it's like the whole narrative and the story of him being so separate from his family and wanting to be different and just wanting to live a normal life in Canada. Well, living a normal life in Canada doesn't include getting to talk to your terrorist sister. It doesn't include traveling to Saudi Arabia. It doesn't include getting to completely erase, the mistakes you've made. And now he's challenging that decision that was made by the U.S. Military Tribunal, where the entire confession and his apology to the Spear family, the soldier that the U.S. medic that died from the grenade that he confessed to shooting, well, he's saying that confession came under duress and that he didn't really mean it. So it's like, okay, so is he even sorry? Does he even acknowledge the past?
Yeah, he's also got the $100 million judgment against him, which was, again, in Utah, the one from Tabitha Spear's family. Or the family of Christopher Spear, Tabitha Spear. And then he's also got, and people forget, it's not just his confession that the whole case hinged on. I mean, there was evidence at the scene, including, by the way, video evidence of him making IEDs. So it's very possible, in fact probable, that he has a death toll that's much higher than just Christopher Spear. So we're not talking about this guy who was just wandering through the foothills of Afghanistan and, caught in a crossfire here. Like, this is someone who was actually a cog in the Al-Qaeda machine there. And for him to use what, people will be saying around Christmas time of, oh, that's just, kooky Aunt Kay that gets into the eggnog. Like, oh, yeah, everyone's got the kooky cousin who's a terrorist. I mean, that's not my family, but he's just thinking, oh, yeah, whatever, who is family, right?
It's interesting. Okay, well we'll wait and hopefully we'll find out what happens next Friday. We'll await reports from True North Initiative. You can find all the updates here on our site. So thank you. I think this was a pretty good test run of doing the side-by-side video with Andrew and I. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to check out the True North Initiative's website, join one of our clubs. We've got a lot of exciting news coming up in the new year, lots of reporting and special perks and products for our followers and our supporters. So thanks so much for watching, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you all.